and Logistics of UNCTAD, that's the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where she is responsible for the Secretariat's work in the field of transport law and policy, and this includes work since 2008 on the implications of climate change for maritime transport, with a focus on climate change impacts and adaptation for seaports and other key transport infrastructure. Regina holds a law degree from the University of Augsburg. She is a barrister in England and Wales and an attorney at law in Greece, so behave yourselves. Regina, welcome.
Thank you very much. Ooh, there's a lot of light here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to present to you some of our work and to contribute to this very important conference. Let me just check how I operate the is this the, that's the one?
It's just forward.
Yeah.
Red is back.
Okay. Let's just see if that works. So I don't have a, no, because I have a little arrow. Anyway, I will have to get by. I don't know if this one works. We'll see. It doesn't matter. So climate change impacts and adaptation for coastal transport infrastructure in small island developing states. The case for action is the title for my presentation. And essentially, I'm going to give you a little bit of the global policy context and tell you about our work in the field with particular emphasis on small island developing states. Okay, starting. Maritime transport and the environment. We are already there in this forum, but I think it is important to concentrate our minds and to recall that the environment and maritime transport, there is a dialectic relationship. Maritime transport is absolutely critical for us because it facilitates global trade to the tune of more than 80% of carriage of world trade in terms of volume, and at least 70% in terms of value. Globalization means that we are extremely integrated and interconnected, and that again is very important. You have to zoom out and realize we're all in the same boat, and that includes developed and developing countries. With over 60% of trade being loaded and unloaded in developing countries, this is very important. So even in this context of preparing ports for the impacts of climate change and ensuring the smooth flow of goods through supply chains, it's very important to bear in mind there is no them and us. So the rich and the poor have to, as it were, work together. Everybody's in the same boat. Environmental challenges come in two forms, two sides of the coins. There are obviously the effects of the sectoral work of the industry on the environment, and that covers all areas of pollution, including greenhouse gas emissions in the context of climate change. But by the same token, there are environmental impacts on maritime transport, particularly the impacts of climatic variability and change. It's critical to address these global challenges also in the light of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Mark Major yesterday morning mentioned briefly the importance of this in the context of the international agenda and the community's agenda. And I will say something about this in due course. Climate variability and change has been called by the UN Secretary General, the past now UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, a defining issue of our era. Now this is very important in that the United Nations doesn't go out and pronounce things by itself. This is a reflection of the recognized importance of the issue on the global policy agenda. There's compelling scientific evidence, as you know, increasingly so, with the AR5, which came out in 2013, and also very important, focusing the minds of international policymakers and citizens and industry has been the Stern Review on the economic impacts of climate change, which projected that in the order of 5% of global GDP at least annually could be at risk in the face of inaction. Now, whether these figures are right or wrong doesn't matter, but the order of magnitude is, of course, vast, and it means there is a cause for action. Climate change and its impact poses a particular development threat for countries that are struggling. Amongst these groups of countries, like the least developed countries, which, as the name suggests, are the poorest, and the small island developing states, which are in particular lacking capacity to adapt. Since 2008, the organization I work for, UNCTAD, has been integrating climate change consideration into its work on transportation. This has been very early, considering the developments internationally. Now, I was trying to show you a slide. I'm going to leave that till the end because this little arrow is not going to work with my equipment here. I need a cursor for this. I'm going to show you a little bit what we've done in the field leading up to our current work. Or I could just talk about it because I know the slide is at the end. So we have been conducting an expert meeting first in 2009 on maritime transport and the climate change challenge. It was very well attended by everybody in the industry and internationally, or the international organizations as well. We later published a book of commissioned papers with Earthscan in 2012, which is multidisciplinary, quite unique in this field. And we started considering increasingly the issue of adaptation with a 2011 expert meeting focusing on adaptation for ports, with work we did together with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which is also working on an expert group which we jointly set up on this topic and which is ongoing. And a series of expert meetings which we held on the particular issues, transport-related challenges facing small island developing states. So this work in an integrated fashion, if you will, drawing on the research and the meetings, has led us to the ongoing technical cooperation project we're engaged in, which focuses on small island developing states, and to which I'm going to get in a moment in a bit more detail. The implications of climate variability and a change for maritime transport are manifold. There are, of course, these two sides to the coin. And I like this example because my experience has been that people really do find it difficult to distinguish between these two different sides. Now, mitigation is, of course, critical, and we all know this, but it is directed at addressing the causes of climate change, and therefore, by definition, the anthropogenic causes of climate change, and by definition is directed at finding solutions in the longer term. Nothing we do today in terms of CO2 emissions control is going to show any effect within the next 50 years, for example. By contrast, adaptation is action directed at coping with the impacts of climate variability and change at all time scales, so short, medium, and long term. That requires an understanding of the impacts. These, however, vary considerably by type of forcing, region, sector, and, if I may say so, physical setting. So as people in the room will know, ports in, let's say, river deltas face completely different challenges from open sea ports. And in some parts of the world, floods and storms are going to be particularly problematic, whereas elsewhere it might be melting permafrost. So it all varies, and you have to look at these impacts to understand them to adapt properly, of course. In maritime transport, as in transportation generally, much of the debate focuses on mitigation, and comparatively little focus has been paid to the study of impacts and the development of adaptation options. The types of impacts that we might expect are, of course, direct and indirect. And the factors that I mentioned there, sea level rise, temperature and precipitation changes, extreme storms and floods and other factors, are likely to have direct impacts in the form of damage, disruption, and delays to infrastructure and trade through supply chains. It's very important because of this enormous economic knock-on effects of disruption and delay. And by way of parenthesis, I could just say there is a lot of work going on in terms of trade facilitation, which is all focused on saving time and thereby money. But of course, all of this means nothing if physically there is going to be a massive delay, however much you speed up the paper processes. So there are these direct effects. And then there are indirect effects, which have to do, of course, with changes to demand, changes to production location, agriculture production, etc. There's also going to be so-called positive effects in the sense of opening sea lanes, which were previously closed. This is the melting polar ice. And in general, we can say whatever the effects in a particular region or in a particular port, whatever transport-related challenges a place is facing, these might be exacerbated by some of the effects of climate change. To give you some illustration, let's just focus on the storms and associated surges and flooding. On the left here, you see a figure which is based on actual storm data. It shows seaports within 50 kilometers of tropical sea storm track based on US data. And as you can see, the small island developing states in the Caribbean and also in the Indian Ocean, there are three groups basically, three regional groups, Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and then Pacific. All of these are well in the center of some of these storm tracks, as are in fact, as you can see, many of the world's largest ports in Asia and in the United States. On the right-hand side, you see a model showing visually what inundation could look like in the case of here a relatively modest Category 3 storm surge and a half a meter of mean sea level rise. This is the port of Providence in the United States, and this has been modeled by colleagues there, Austin Becker. All the pictures that I'm showing you, all these slides, they are based on presentations that were given at some of our meetings and the US Gulf Coast study is particularly worth highlighting because this is a seminal piece of work initiated in the United States by the Department of Transport post-Katrina in the area of the Gulf Coast. This is where 60% of the US energy exports go through. Under a relative sea level rise scenario of about 1.2 meters, more than 2,400 miles of road could be permanently inundated. Over 70% of the existing port facilities, 9% of the railway lines, and 3 airports. So this is quite impressive, I would say, and if I may say so, this was the presentation, or the presentation on this study, which in 2009 really made the penny drop at the expert meeting we had, which focused on mitigation and adaptation, where everybody realized, oh look, it's in our interest to deal with that, rather than having to do something because it's the thing to do. Is really in our interest. Temporary flooding, which is associated with storms, can of course be very important, and just by, if you look, Katrina was, for example, 8 meters in some locations. So just, I don't have time of course to go through this, but just for illustration. Here's some work done in Japan on the costs, just to gauge a little bit, or to illustrate a little bit the order of magnitude of the costs. Which you can see depends, of course, on the location and so on. This is the Bay of Tokyo. So on the left, you can see areas at flood risk. If you put together the mean expected storm surge due to future storm typhoons in the year 2100 at 2 sea level rise scenarios, 59 centimeters and 1.9 meters. And you can see the flooding 2.7 meters and 1.4. And if you look what the cost would be, you can see the simulated damages here for Tokyo and Kanagawa port areas due to the combined effect of these factors. And you can see, for example, 2.7 is close to 30 trillion yen, which is $266 billion. Now, this is a model, and of course, it always depends what you take into account, but just in terms of order of magnitude, it certainly shows you the calls for action. These are some of the major climate change impacts on ports. There are many, so there's a lot of work to be done. Now, as concerns SIDS, these countries are very remote, small, and highly vulnerable to external shocks. They are very dependent on import, face higher transport costs than most parts of the world, and are anyway exposed to climate change and natural disasters and have low adaptive capacity. Ports and airports are more critical than elsewhere because all eggs are in one basket, and ports and airports transport energy, food, and the all-important tourism. And there's a very close nexus between tourism and transportation and climate change, affecting both the transport network infrastructure, which brings the tourism, and the beaches and coasts, which are the main assets for this tourism. And to show you this, this is a slide from 2011, so not too up to date actually, from ECLAC, showing you the arrivals by air in these countries and also the contribution of tourism. And this is well over 50% in some countries, and the arrival is close to 100% in some cases. So this is one slide here on the impacts that an event can have. This was 1 day extreme rainfall in Dominica, 434 millimeters of rain, and that caused in the 1 day a loss, which has been estimated in the rapid assessment at 90% of Dominica's GDP. So you can see this is a very serious case. Now, this is the project that we have initiated, and we are progressing to the end of it. It focuses on developing a methodology to help these countries adapt their critical transport infrastructure, ports and airports, to the impacts of climate change. We do this based on a case study approach focusing on Jamaica and St. Lucia, two very different countries in that region. And the aim is, of course, to help these countries themselves and to make this methodology transferable so it can be used in other small island developing states and hopefully elsewhere. We've had a technical expert meeting last summer, and in fact, Jan Brook from Piank was also participating in that. We are holding workshops this year, and by the end of the year, I think we should be having this in place. If you allow me a few additional seconds, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda has already been mentioned. What's important, this represents the international community's agreed forward-looking approach over the next 15 years to address development challenges, and it's integrated and indivisible. This is very important. So everything is seen to be connected. And transport is a cross-cutting issue which affects many of these goals and targets, including target 1.5, and that's worth highlighting because it seeks to eradicate poverty, which is absolutely critical in the catalogue of priorities. And this is also contributing to this. Finally, just one word to say, regulation is going to play an important part in implementing that, and generally for adaptation. Notably in the EU, there is a new directive or an amended directive entering into force on the 17th of May this year, the amended EIA directive, which requires now in the context of infrastructure projects, large ones or smaller ones where you have to consider an EIA, it requires to consider also the impacts of climate change. And if we don't know anything more about that, what we do know is that it will require that you can't just go by past experience. You also will have to go, for instance, by projections for the future. With that, obviously, I have to come. This was a slide I couldn't show you. I have come to the end, and I thank you very much for your attention. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.